Chapter 1. The Lightless Metropolis. Anatomy of a gun. Deck. Imagine the crushing weight of billions of tons of adamantium and plasteel pressing down upon your skull. This is not a theoretical terror. It is the waking reality of the lower decks aboard a vast Imperial cruiser. Here, the ambient air is a thick, choking soup of unbearable heat and pulverized rust. The silence of the void is banished by a deafening, eternal roar. Though the colossal plasma drives lie leagues away in the aft, their wrathful resonance vibrates through every bone in a human body. Grinding gears the size of cathedral domes scream as they turn in the shadows. This is the macro cannon deck. To perceive this space as a mere compartment or a simple corridor is a failure of mortal comprehension. It is a sprawling, lightless metropolis of war. Layer upon layer of rusted iron catwalks crisscross the abyss, creating a labyrinth of jagged metal. These walkways are suspended over nothingness by chains thick enough to anchor a planetary block. To understand the architecture of an Imperial void, ship is to confront a maddening impossibility of scale. These vessels are flying monuments to brutalist Gothic excess. Their structural design fundamentally rejects the fragility of mortal flesh. Vast, cavernous expanses are dedicated entirely to the housing and transportation of titanic munitions. Cathedrals of destruction are erected solely to store shells the size of civilian towers. Human habitation is not an afterthought, it is an entirely disregarded concept. The machinery is deemed sacred by the masters of the vessel. The serf population is merely expendable fodder, forced into the suffocating crevices between immense hydraulic rams and blistering coolant pipes. Every breath taken in this iron hell is a foul cocktail of misery. The lungs burn constantly with the acrid stench of ozone and leaking promethium fuel. Beneath that potent chemical shroud lies the inescapable reek of unwashed sweat and oxidized blood. Countless generations of serfs bleed and die upon these unforgiving floors. Their final gasps go entirely unnoticed, their physical essence rusting into the very deck plating. Within this colossal carcass of iron, a collective mass of enslaved humanity toils without end. They are nameless, faceless thralls. They exist in a state of perpetual darkness, rarely seeing even the sickly glow of a single lumen globe. They move like swarms of blind insects through the claustrophobic guts of a slain leviathan. These wretched souls pull the massive chains, heave the colossal shells, and grease the holy cogs with their own ruined bodies. To look upon this sprawling gun city is to see the Imperium distilled to its most cruel and unyielding truth. It is a place where human life is spent like cheap currency to feed the hungry guns. Yet if one stares long enough into this abyssal hive of misery, the sheer scale of the suffering begins to blur. The attention must eventually drift away from the grand, sprawling horror of the macro deck. It must pierce through the toxic steam and the jagged shadows. It must move purposefully past hundreds of thousands of broken, toiling souls. Down in the deepest, most suffocating trench of the primary loading mechanisms, a single microscopic speck of life labours against the dark. Amongst the teeming millions of the void-born, this solitary figure grips a rusted lever. He stands completely unaware that his insignificant, miserable existence is about to fracture the grinding monotony of the void. Chapter 2. Born in the Dark, the life of a void serf. Beneath the crushing majesty of the macro structures lies the true currency of the Imperium, flesh. Consider Kael. He is a 50th-generation deck-thrall, bound to the abyssal gun decks of a void leviathan whose high Gothic name he lacks the biological capacity to pronounce. Kael has never seen a planetary sunrise. He does not know what the word sky means. His entire universe is defined by a handful of square paces of blood-stained, rusted iron grating. Here he was born. Here he bleeds. Here he will eventually collapse and be ground into the deck plating. His hands move with mindless rhythm. He performs repetitive maintenance on a colossal chain link, scraping away corrosion that is older than his recorded bloodline. The environment has claimed him completely. sculpting his very physiology to suit its cruel needs. His spine is permanently hunched into a twisted arch, broken early by the suffocating clearance of the underdeck service tunnels. His eyes are practically black voids. The pupils are grotesquely enlarged, a degraded genetic adaptation bred over centuries to capture whatever meager light escapes the flickering lumen globes above. Beneath a crust of ancient grease, his skin is a translucent, sickly pale. Every ragged breath he takes is a wheezing testament to terminal lung rot. He inhales nothing but the recycled soot, incense and toxic exhaust of 1,000 generations. To the aristocratic officers of the Navis Imperialis, Kael is not a human being. He is not even classified as official crew. In the sprawling vellum ledgers of the ship's quartermasters, the void-born serfs of the lowest decks are recorded strictly as expendable inventory. They are tallied and accounted for alongside adamantium plating, promethium reserves and spare servitor limbs. They are an expendable resource, bred in the dark to die in the dark. The very concept of ascension in this lightless realm is a laughable heresy. A man is defined entirely by the machinery he is shackled to. Kael belongs to a singular winch station. His grandfather turned this very wheel until his heart burst from the strain. His father took over the labour before the old man's corpse was even cold. Now Kael bears the inherited weight of the mechanism. In this abyssal pit, the concept of innocence is a forgotten heresy. Childhood simply does not exist. The cycle of human life is violently accelerated to feed the ceaseless hunger of the ship. The very moment a toddler possesses the motor skills to walk unassisted, a heavy iron chain is pressed into their trembling hands. They are taught the sacred liturgy of rust removal before they ever learn to speak their own names. They die exactly as they lived, ignorant cogs in a machine of unyielding despair. Kael coughs violently, wiping a mixture of blood and soot from his ruined brow. He pauses his endless scraping as the ambient temperature suddenly drops. The eternal thrum of the deck plates shifts into a deafening, groaning pitch. A vast and terrible shadow slowly eclipses the meagre glow of the work gang's lanterns. Kael strains his mutated eyes upward into the gloom. The time for mindless maintenance has ended, and the time for agonizing labor has arrived. Chapter 3. The Ambient Lethality of the Iron Tomb. To simply exist within the iron belly of a void ship is an act of attrition against one's own mortality. Before a single winch is turned or a single loading chain is pulled, the environment itself wages a ceaseless war upon the flesh of Kael and his fellow serfs. The gun deck is a cavern of ambient lethality. Invisible waves of ionizing radiation bleed freely from ancient, unshielded power conduits that snake along the vaulted ceilings. Below, the deck plating is slick with coagulated pools of highly toxic promethium runoff and sacred machine oils. A single misstep into these iridescent puddles means chemical burns that eat through issued rags and melt skin down to the bone. The ambient temperature is a suffocating entity of its own. The sheer radiating heat bakes the iron bulkheads to such extremes that a bare hand pressed against the metal will instantly blister and fuse to the iron. Then there is the noise. It is not merely a sound, but a physical pressure that crushes the skull and vibrates the marrow within every spine. This is the colossal heartbeat of the ship, the thrumming roar of the massive plasma drives. The deafening volume obliterates any hope of normal speech. To communicate in the macro battery trenches, the slaves must scream until their throats bleed or rely on a crude, frantic sign language born of sheer desperation. Every waking moment is spent enduring this sensory assault, while trying desperately to conserve whatever meager calories their starving bodies possess. This profound hostility of the lower decks is no mere accident of age or decay. It is the calculated, cruel design of the Adeptus Mechanicus. To the tech priests who monitor the vessel's efficiency, human life is an infinitely renewable resource, whereas the cooling systems of a holy macro cannon are sacred and precious. Life support protocols for the gun decks are intentionally severed or throttled to less than a fraction of minimum human requirements. The purest atmospheric scrubbers and thermal regulators are routed entirely to the weapon batteries to keep the machine spirits appeased. As a direct result, the slaves are left to suffocate in a blistering oven-like heat that cooks the very moisture from their lungs. They breathe a recycled, foul atmosphere thick with ozone, vaporized grease, and the exhaled rot of 10,000 dying men. The Martian priesthood knows well that the serfs will expire rapidly in these conditions, but millions more breed and fester in the lightless hab warrens, waiting to take their place. Kael crouches in the shadows of a gargantuan loading crane, panting heavily as the toxic air burns his ruined lungs. He watches his brethren huddle against the slightly cooler deck plates, hoarding every ounce of their waning strength. They wait in the suffocating dark, knowing that the agonizing stillness is about to end. Suddenly, the rusted iron walls tremble as the blaring wail of the shift klaxons tears through the thunderous hum of the engines. The merciless cycle begins anew, drawing every hollow-eyed gaze upward toward the monolithic payload of destruction they are now summoned to lift. Chapter 4. The Monolith of Death. The Macro Shell. Out of the choking gloom of the magazine rises the central idol of their endless labor. It is not merely a weapon, but a monolithic spire of polished brass and high explosives that towers hundreds of feet into the artificial night of the gun deck. At the base of this terrifying majesty, the labor force stands paralyzed by awe and existential terror. They are less than insects, frail specks of organic matter dwarfed like ants at the foot of an uncaring metal mountain. Every inch of the towering casing is layered with litanies of destruction and holy runes of targeting, painstakingly etched by blind servitors over a span of standard decades. This singular macro shell is a masterpiece of martial theology, an artifact demanding absolute reverence from those who must soon bleed for its deployment. To comprehend the logistics of Imperial macro ordnance is to gaze into the abyss of humanity's ruinous obsession with war. Beneath the blessed brass exterior lies enough concentrated devastation to shatter tectonic plates. Depending on the holy dictates of the masters of ordnance, some of these titanic shells house temperamental plasma fusion payloads encased in blessed adamantium that detonate with city-shattering fury. Others contain concentrated incendiary promethium gel, designed to reduce rebellious hive cities to glowing radioactive glass, or solid dense core diamantine penetrators engineered to core out the armored hearts of enemy battleships. The creation of this specific munition required the violently stripped resources of entire moons and the expenditure of immeasurable planetary tithes. It has been blessed by orthodox high priests of the cult Mechanicus, anointed with rare sacred oils, and preserved in stasis crypts for centuries until this exact moment of violent deliverance. Yet in the darkest irony of the Imperium, this object of unfathomable technological worship will be maneuvered into the breach by the most worthless commodity in the galaxy. Human life is infinitely cheaper than the refined promethium required to fuel an automated loading engine. The thousands of shivering, malnourished serfs ordered to haul this incalculable weight by hand possess no value whatsoever in the unblinking eyes of the Emperor's bureaucracy. Their wretched lives are entirely expendable. Measured only in the brief moments of traction their breaking bones can provide against the massive iron decking. It is a profound absurdity of scale and cruelty that defies all rational thought, yet it remains the very foundation upon which the Imperium endures the long night. Slowly, trembling hands reach out in the suffocating darkness, wrapping blistered fingers around links of iron that are the size of full-grown men. The rusted chains are dragged agonizingly across the blood-stained grating and finally lashed to the colossal winching rings of the heavy adamantium sled cradling the mighty shell. Cruel lash masters raise their heavy electro-whips, the violent blue crackle of energy briefly illuminating the terrified, soot-stained faces of the condemned workforce. High above them, The vast mechanisms of the block and tackle lock into their brutal alignment with a sickening metallic thud that echoes through the cavernous chamber. Breath is drawn into 1,000 starving lungs as the merciless masters of the gun deck prepare to give the final, unforgiving command to heave. Chapter 5. The Symphony of Chains. The colossal plasteel-forged chains lie slack against the rusted deck, each link as thick as the marble pillars of an Imperial basilica. At the barked commands of the deck wardens, tens of thousands of men, women and children step forward into the suffocating shadow of the macro shell. They lock themselves into heavy iron harnesses, the cold, unforgiving metal biting deep into scarred flesh and atrophied muscle. Kael secures the crude iron clasps over his shoulders, his breath fogging in the chill, chemical-laced air of the loading bay. A deafening mechanical klaxon echoes through the cavernous chamber, signaling the start of the merciless ascent. Together, an ocean of humanity leans forward, throwing their collective weight against the bindings to take up the slack in the massive chains. The Symphony of Chains begins with a singular, terrifying groan of strained metal rebelling against an unimaginable, crushing mass. The spire-sized munition must be dragged up a steep, grooved incline toward the waiting breech of the ship's macro cannon. Every forward step is an agonizing negotiation with gravity. Muscles tear, tendons snap, and joints pop violently out of their sockets as the impossible mass begins its microscopic, grinding crawl. Kael pushes his failing body entirely past the point of biological tolerance. His worn boots desperately find purchase on the blood-slicked iron grating, his spine curving under a crushing pressure that threatens to snap him in half. He is but one tiny, suffering gear in a vast biological machine. To the uninitiated observer, this barbaric spectacle defies all logic of a star-spanning empire. Why would a civilization capable of tearing the veil to traverse the immaterium and incinerating entire worlds rely on the crude application of manual labor to arm its greatest weapons? The dark answer lies in the fundamental philosophy of the Navis Imperialis. Flesh is the ultimate, infinitely renewable resource of the Emperor. Unlike complex mechanical loading cranes, mortal flesh is abundantly self-replenishing and demands only the most wretched of organic sustenance. An automated loading cradle requires sacred unguents, rare replacement parts forged on distant forge worlds, and the constant paranoid ministrations of tech priests to placate its fickle machine spirit. More importantly, a mob of chained laborers cannot be corrupted by the malignant scrap code of the archenemy. They are entirely immune to the scrap code shrieks and haywire bursts that would render advanced cogitators dead and silent. When the enemy strikes and advanced machinery fails, the terror and desperation of mortal meat can always be whipped into action until death. Thus, the Imperium gladly trades oceans of blood for absolute reliability. For endless hours, the grueling rhythm of the pull consumes the minds and bodies of the loaders. It is a slow, agonizing crawl that measures progress not in meters, but in bloody millimeters. The recycled air grows thick with the copper stench of sweat, void sickness, and open wounds. A collective, ragged chant eventually emerges from the toiling masses, establishing a desperate rhythm to synchronize their unified suffering. The massive iron loading sled shrieks as it slides up the inclined rail, the immense friction generating waves of blistering heat that wash over the closest workers. Yet mortal flesh can only endure so much before the structural integrity of the human body begins to rapidly degrade. Hearts burst within narrow chests, and weakened bodies simply collapse into the grinding gears of the massive track. As sheer exhaustion claims the weakest among them, the massive munition groans, its upward momentum threatening to stall completely. The agonizing pace begins to slip, the tremendous weight pulling backward against the remaining tethered workers. A sudden, terrifying loss of tension ripples down the primary chains, leaving the entire line teetering on the edge of a catastrophic collapse. Chapter 6. The Lash of the Overseers. To drag such impossible burdens requires motivation born of absolute terror. Look up from the sweat and the blood of the trench floor to the rusted catwalks suspended in the gloom. There, pacing like predatory wolves, are the ship taskmasters and overseers. These men and women are towering brutes, well fed on high-yield protein rations and heavily modified with crude augmetics. They carry heavy stub pistols strapped to their massive thighs, but their true weapon of choice is the crackling electro-whip. The air down here is permanently stained with the acrid stench of ozone and the sickening sweetness of searing flesh. With every step the chain gangs take, the merciless crack of energy whips echoes through the cavernous holds. Mercy is a heresy not tolerated in the bowels of a void ship. The hierarchy of this subterranean security force is brutal and uncompromising. At the lowest tier are the shift bosses, elevated slaves granted a scrap of authority and a club to beat their former brethren. Above them walk the enforcers and the augmented overseers, armed and armoured, completely detached from the suffering below. Commanding these sadists are the unforgiving officers of the naval armsmen, grim figures in heavy carapace armour who enforce the Lord Captain's will with combat shotguns and bolt pistols. To this chain of command, the millions of labourers grovelling in the dark are not human beings. They are merely biological cogs in the great machine of the Imperium. Flesh is cheap, abundant, and easily replaced. These overseers believe with religious fervour that such flesh thralls only understand the language of extreme pain. Hundreds of decks above this misery, far beyond the reach of the smog and the screaming, the ship's bridge calculates the logistics of the voyage. Aristocratic officers in pristine uniforms decree the daily quotas necessary to keep the macro engines burning and the gun batteries fed. These numbers cascade down through the strata of the ship, growing more tyrannical with every deck they descend. By the time the quota reaches the overseers, it is an absolute law of survival. If a hauling gang misses their mandated target by a single heartbeat, there is no leniency. There is only the Emperor's unforgiving judgment. The overseers will systematically execute a tithe of the labour gang, gunning down dozens of exhausted souls in a storm of stub fire to terrorise the survivors into hauling harder. The corpses are simply tossed into the reclamation vats, while fresh bodies are immediately chained to the still warm harnesses. Fear of this arbitrary slaughter drives the labour force beyond the limits of mortal endurance. They pull until muscles tear and bones splinter. They march forward even as the crackling energy of the whips strips the skin from their spines. The overseers care nothing for the shattered vertebrae or the lungs collapsing from exertion. They only care that the chain remains taut. Yet this relentless application of violence is only half of the horror inflicted upon the serfs. As the whips fall and the taskmasters howl their demands, the labourers must also confront the inescapable deterioration of their own fragile forms. Chapter 7. Anatomy of Ruin, the Physical Toll. The irradiated blood of the fallen splatters across the rusted deck plates. It is a grim testament to the absolute physiological failure demanded by the merciless overseers. The human form was created in the divine image of the God Emperor. Yet here, in the abyssal depths, it is systematically unmade. Flesh and bone are ground down into little more than industrial lubricant. There is a grotesque anatomy to this ruin, a terrifying catalogue of afflictions utterly unique to the macro chain gangs. Massive tension cables suddenly snap and whip through the darkness, degloving fingers from slipping iron in a sudden spray of crimson. Lethal radiation flares from the unshielded macro rails wash over the struggling crews without warning. These blinding flashes sear unprotected retinas instantly, leaving the serfs permanently blinded in the dark. Decades of relentless, agonizing hauling reshape the human skeleton entirely. Spines become permanently fused into a hunched, subhuman posture, locking the workers forever into the wretched shape of their servitude. Kael feels the inescapable truth of this ruin in his own deteriorating flesh. His hands are no longer the hands of a man. They are brutalized, bleeding instruments of blind labor. Thick, unnatural calluses have formed over his palms and fingers, calcifying into dense, unfeeling pads of dead skin and trapped metallic grit. Fresh blood weeps from deep fissures beneath the hardened tissue, but he cannot feel the rough texture of the links he pulls anymore. He only registers the crushing mechanical pressure of the planetary weight tearing at his joints. Every muscle fibre in his arms screams with microscopic tears, yet he does not dare loosen his grip. In the sprawling void, leviathans and vast forge complexes of the Imperium, there is absolutely no salvation for the injured. There are no Medicae stations in these toxic lower holds. There are no benevolent servo skulls bearing vials of synthetic coagulant or soothing balms for the condemned. The Adeptus Mechanicus and the ruthless shipmasters view these indentured souls strictly through the lens of cold, mathematical efficiency. To the masters of mankind, a broken human is nothing more than a broken tool. When a mere piece of machinery fails, it is discarded and replaced. Here the medical doctrine of the lower decks is brutally simple. A labourer either pushes through the blinding agony of torn ligaments and shattered bones, or they do not. Those weak few who cannot maintain the grueling, unrelenting pace are simply cut from their heavy leather harnesses. Their limp, ruined bodies are mercilessly kicked into the Stygian bilges far below. They are left to drown in acidic, toxic runoff, abandoned to rot in the suffocating dark alongside the countless generations that preceded them. Survival on the chain requires a total surrender of one's innate humanity, replacing hope with the simple rhythm of the haul. Yet the frail vessel of mortal flesh can only endure so much torment before the spirit finally breaks. Beside Kael, the exhausted worker who just collapsed continues to choke violently on his own irradiated internal fluids. His devastating failure to rise creates a sudden lethal slack in the primary linkage. The rhythmic, synchronized pulling of the entire gang is instantly shattered. Thousands of tons of suspended macro munitions begin to shift against the compromised tension line. The massive iron chain screams loudly in the dark as the unfathomable weight violently redistributes itself. Chapter 8. The Indifference of the Gears. The limits of human endurance finally shatter under the impossible mass of the macro cannon shell. A sudden, catastrophic shift in the ordnance's weight sends a violently kinetic shockwave down the length of the primary hauling chain. Taut links of blackened iron jerk backward with the force of a striking leviathan. Hundreds of exhausted slaves lose their precarious footing on the slick iron decking in a single, terrifying heartbeat. The rusted chain is violently ripped through torn and blistered palms. Desperate workers are yanked off their feet, their harness tethers suddenly transforming into unyielding instruments of their doom. They are dragged relentlessly backward toward the colossal grinding cogwheels of the primary winch housing. Kael dives to the blood-stained deck, tearing at his harness release just as the massive iron teeth of the primary gear sweep past his face. He can only watch in numb, paralyzed horror as dozens of his kin are hoisted into the mechanical abyss. The colossal gears do not slow, nor do they hesitate. They catch the first wave of screaming slaves, pulling them into the interstitial spaces between the mesh of monolithic iron teeth. Piercing shrieks of sudden agony are instantly drowned out by the sickening wet crunch of collapsing rib cages and bursting skulls. The holy machinery of the macro battery has no safety mechanisms, and it possesses no protocols for the preservation of mortal flesh. In the cold and unforgiving calculus of the Adeptus Mechanicus, this slaughter is a known and accepted variable of deep void naval operation. It is the grim, unspoken doctrine of blood lubrication. When soft human matter is dragged into the unyielding turning mechanisms, the monumental gears do not jam or falter. The sheer torque of the engine simply masticates the interlopers, grinding meat, splintered bone, and ragged uniform into a thick crimson paste that greases the turning axles. The ancient machine spirit of the primary winch demands a continuous offering of kinetic energy, and it cares nothing if that energy is provided by pulling muscles or pulverized bodies. The sacred machinery thrives on this sacrifice, its deep rumbling hum growing smoother as the biological debris coats its moving parts. From the elevated brass gantries, the overseers witness the mass slaughter without a single shred of pity. They do not sound alarms to halt the turning gears, nor do they reach out to save the dying. Instead, they draw their crackling electro-whips and begin beating the surviving workers with renewed, furious intensity. Traction has been lost, and the living must pull twice as hard to compensate for the weight of the dead, now wedged within the lower cogworks. Under a merciless rain of searing lashes, Kael and the remaining labourers heave against the slipping, blood-slicked chain. They plant their boots into the freshly spilled gore of their own brethren, throwing their shattered forms against the immense resistance of the cables. Slowly, agonizingly, the backward slide of the warhead is arrested. With one final lung-tearing effort born of absolute terror and impending death, the hauling gangs drag the monstrous munition over the threshold. The colossal brass-cased shell finally comes to rest in the shadowy, vaulted expanse of the firing antechamber. Massive locking clamps slam down over the warhead with an echoing metallic finality. The heavy iron hauling collars suddenly go slack, granting the exhausted, trembling survivors a fleeting, desperate reprieve in the darkness before their grim faith demands its due. In the fleeting quiet of the brief rest cycle, Kael lies upon a cold iron grate and stares upward into the weeping darkness of the overhead bulkhead. Just meters beyond that heavy adamantium plating lies a vast and infinite cosmos, teeming with celestial wonders and unimaginable galactic horrors. Yet Kael has never seen a single star. He does not possess the vocabulary to even conceptualize the freezing void of space. To him, the universe does not consist of swirling galaxies, radiant nebulae, or orbital spheres. He does not know what a planet is. If an overseer were to speak to him of atmospheric blue or worlds carpeted in living flora, those words would be as completely meaningless to him as the high cant of the navigators. The mind of the indentured voidsman is a sealed tomb, meticulously stripped of all external context. These wretched souls know absolutely nothing of the extragalactic horrors that devour worlds. They are blissfully oblivious to the feral Xenos empires that besiege the Imperium, and they are entirely ignorant of the corrupting, maddening whispers of the arch-enemy. In their localized, claustrophobic reality, the universe is not a grand tapestry of warring galactic empires. Their entire existence is defined solely by the inescapable holy trinity of rust, iron chains, and oppressive mechanical heat. The absolute boundary of their reality ends at the soot-stained bulkheads of the macro-cannon battery. This absolute engineered ignorance is not an accident of circumstance, but a deliberate and merciless weapon of the Imperium. The Ministorum clerics and the aristocratic shipmasters alike understand that total ignorance is the purest armor against both heresy and rebellion. A slave who cannot perceive a world beyond his chains will never attempt to break them. By violently suppressing all geographical, historical, and astronomical knowledge, the masters ensure that the very concept of freedom is erased from the genetic memory of the lower decks. The cognitive map of a macro-cannon loader is entirely restricted to the immediate geography of the gun deck. To travel to the edge of the known universe is merely to walk from the primary loading hoist to the secondary ventilation shaft. Even their understanding of the divine has been grotesquely warped by this suffocating confinement. To the serfs labouring in the belly of the Leviathan, the god-emperor of mankind is not a withered saviour sitting upon a golden throne on distant Terra. Holy Terra is not a physical world to them, but a mythological afterlife they can never hope to reach. Instead, the Emperor is an abstract, terrifying force of ultimate judgment, perfectly synonymous with the distant ship captain. The master of the vessel is the literal voice of God, dealing death and demanding endless blood toil from the unreachable, mythical heights of the command bridge. Bereft of the true cosmos, the desperate minds of the slaves must inevitably find meaning in the dark abyss of their immediate surroundings. Trapped in a lightless world where the only absolute truth is endless suffering, they begin to look at the massive cogs and gears with a twisted reverence. In the absence of a true heaven, they slowly start to construct their own horrifying theology from the groaning metal and the deep shadows that dance across the bleeding hull. Chapter 10. The Cult of the God Engine. In the suffocating dark of the lower decks, ignorance is a fertile soil for madness. With trembling hands, Kael and the surviving labourers gather the shattered remains of those crushed by the great chains. They smear the fresh blood of the dead across the cold iron curvature of the macro shell, painting crude warding marks upon its surface. Their cracked lips mutter broken syllables of a deeply corrupted litany. They do not understand the galactic war they are fighting, but they understand the terrible hunger of the metal beast that dictates their lives. To the serfs of the gun deck, the towering macro cannon is no mere weapon. It is an idol of wrath, an iron god of the lower decks. It is a wrathful, demanding deity of iron and fire that must be constantly appeased. Along the rusted bulkheads, they have constructed pathetic shrines to this mechanical tyrant. Twisted mounds of spent stubber casings, jagged shrapnel, and human bone are bound together with strips of flayed skin and dried blood. Here, in the claustrophobic nightmare of the undership, the sanctioned Imperial cult has mutated into something feral and utterly unrecognizable. The high-ranking Ministorum clerics who tend the souls of the upper echelons never venture into these toxic, radiation-soaked depths, leaving the flock to fanatical, low-ranking void sect zealots. Left to their own devices for centuries, the isolated slave populations have seamlessly fused emperor worship with a primitive machine animism. They do not pray for salvation or victory. They pray simply that the God engine does not choose them for its next meal. Their hymns are not sung with soaring choirs, but are ground out through the gnashing of teeth and the rhythmic striking of rusted chains against the deck plates. It is a mournful, brutal cadence that echoes the endless thumping of the ship engines. In their wretched theology, the universe outside the hull is a vast abyss ruled by malevolent void spirits. Whenever the vessel shudders from enemy fire or void turbulence, the serfs believe these invisible demons are tearing at the walls of their world. The monolithic shell they have just sacrificed so much to load is revered as a holy messenger. It is a sacred vessel of explosive wrath, meant to be hurled out into the dark to pacify the angry void spirits and keep the encroaching blackness at bay. Blood is the currency of their faith, and the God engine accepts no other coin. Every drop spilled upon the loading rails is seen as a necessary tithe to keep the great iron god sleeping peacefully between its thunderous roaring. Yet this pathetic, blood-soaked micro-religion is not a secret hidden from the masters of the vessel. It is an engineered delusion, carefully permitted to fester because it serves a practical purpose. Faith, no matter how debased, breeds obedience and a willing embrace of martyrdom. Heavy footfalls now echo from the descending gantry elevators, cutting through the rhythmic chanting of the cultists. The grinding gears signal the approach of those who truly understand the machine. The red-robed masters are descending from the upper works, their mechadendrites twitching in the smog. Chapter 11. Angels of Iron, the Tech Priests. The hymn of the labour gangs fades into a terrified, breathless silence as the great bulkhead seals grind apart. Kael throws himself flat against the deck, pressing his scarred face deep into the rusted grating. He does not dare to raise his eyes or draw a sudden breath. The angels of the God engine have descended from the upper tiers. They step gracefully from the shadows of the gantries, draped in heavy robes of Martian red that drag carelessly through the blood and filth of the loading bay. To the ignorant, wretched souls of the gun deck, these beings are no longer men of flesh and blood. They are the divine emissaries of iron and static, the holy custodians of the macro cannon whose very presence commands absolute submission. Writhing metallic appendages, the sacred mechadendrites, snake out from beneath their crimson shrouds like the grasping limbs of iron serpents. As they move, the frozen air grows heavy with the suffocating scent of sacred unguents and burning censer smoke. This thick, oily incense rolls across the deck in dense, suffocating waves. For a fleeting, merciful moment, the sweet chemical perfume masks the ever-present stench of void rot, gangrene, and dying men. The tech priests speak to one another, but not in any tongue known to the mortal ear. They converse in a relentless chattering stream of Binharic cant. It is a harsh metallic burst of static that grates against the skull, sounding to the terrified serfs like the grinding of unseen celestial gears. The adepts of the cult Mechanicus move among the sprawling, kneeling labor force without a single downward glance. To the tech priesthood, the relationship between themselves and the ship's serfs is entirely devoid of pity, empathy, or brotherhood. They do not view Kael or his kin as fellow human beings possessing souls. In the cold, calculating logic of the Omnissiah, these slaves are merely biological components of the macro-canon itself. They are seen as a fleshy, self-replicating subsystem of the loading mechanism, requiring nothing more than basic caloric maintenance and brutal optimization. If a steel pulley snaps under tension, it is swiftly replaced. If a slave breaks his spine beneath the crushing weight of a shell casing, he is swept aside into the reclamation chutes with the exact same level of emotional detachment. The Ordnance Adepts raise their sanctified tools to trace binary litanies across the immense brass-cased surface of the warhead. They anoint the killing instrument with sacred oils, utterly ignoring the bleeding, broken laborers who kneel trembling in the corrosive sludge around their clanking metallic feet. The ritual of the loaded shell nears its absolute mathematical perfection. The final data spikes are driven into the firing manifold, and the holy runic wards ignite with a dull emerald glow in the darkness. Kael presses his ear harder against the cold iron of the floorboards, praying to the Emperor that the red-robed angels will pass him by without a second thought. Yet the blessing of the God Engine is not allowed to reach its sacred conclusion. The static prayers of the priests are suddenly shattered. A deafening, shrieking wail tears through the cavernous expanse of the gun deck, vibrating painfully within the very marrow of the crew. It is the ship-wide klaxon, screaming its terrible warning across every lightless deck and crowded hab block. The abstract, angry void spirits the slaves have always been taught to fear have finally arrived to enact their murderous wrath. Chapter 12. The Holy Act of Martyrdom. The sacred unguents linger on the casing, though the final litanies of priming were violently swallowed by the blaring alarms. Now the spiritual conditioning of the gun deck slaves takes precedence over the mechanical. Within the suffocating darkness of the macro batteries, the overseers and void sect preachers begin their shrieking sermons. They march across catwalks of rusted iron, their heavy brass loudhailers and crackling voxcasters broadcasting the ultimate truth of the lower decks. To survive the upcoming barrage is to deny the Emperor his due. To die in the physical act of loading the gun is the only true path to salvation. The priests scream down into the loading trenches, their voices carrying over the groaning metal. They preach that those who are crushed beneath the immense weight of the hauling chains will have their blood anointed by the machine. They promise that those who are incinerated by the violent blowback of the firing chamber will see their souls fused directly with the God, Engine itself. This is the promise of eternal communion, the ultimate reward for the faithful. It is a religion born from the brutal calculus of the imperium of man, a grim philosophy ingrained in the very foundations of the imperial creed. In the vast and uncaring expanse of the galaxy, a single human life holds absolutely no intrinsic value. Flesh is entirely worthless until it is violently spent in service to the Golden Throne. Humanity is nothing more than infinite coinage, a limitless resource minted solely to be cast into the eternal furnace of war. For these wretched slaves, born in the lightless bowels of a warship they will never leave, their highest possible aspiration is agonizingly simple. Their entire reason for drawing breath is to shave a mere fraction of a second off the loading time of a weapon they lack the intellect to comprehend. To bleed, to tear muscle from bone, and to perish so that the macro cannon might fire one heartbeat sooner is the absolute pinnacle of their miserable existence. Kael understands this divine truth with every fibre of his malnourished body. He tightly grips his heavy leather hauling harness, his knuckles turning white beneath decades of ingrained grease and grime. His heart pounds a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He is entirely possessed by a desperate and fanatical desire to prove his worth to the indifferent metal god towering above him. He does not fear the immense, crushing mass of the shell or the flesh-melting heat of the barrel. He does not pray for salvation, nor does he embrace the priest's promises of glorious martyrdom. He pulls the chain with frantic desperation, driven only by the primal terror of the Lash and the encroaching void. All around him, tens of thousands of men and women weep in religious ecstasy. They beat their chests and chant into the dark, begging the master of mankind to accept their impending sacrifice. The air grows thick with the metallic stench of anticipation and the sour tang of holy terror. Then, the ambient hum of the great vessel changes on a fundamental level. The rhythmic thumping of the plasma drives grows erratic, replaced by a deep, resonant shudder that violently rattles the deck plating. The blaring warning klaxons suddenly shift pitch. They scream a new, frantic note of impending devastation. High above the chanting throngs, the red lumen globes begin to strobe in harsh, blinding flashes. The ship has finally translated from the immaterium and entered the brutal realm of real space void combat. The hymns of the faithful are shattered in an instant as the wrath of the cosmos violently intrudes upon their sanctuary. A sudden and apocalyptic lurch throws Kael hard against a rusted bulkhead. The iron deck pitches wildly beneath his feet, turning thousands of zealous worshippers into a sprawling mass of tangled limbs and bruised flesh. Panic instantly melds with their religious fervor. They scream frantic prayers to the god emperor as the very atmosphere around them turns into a weapon. To be a voidsman trapped within the deep, lightless bowels of an imperial vessel is to experience war entirely as a symphony of blind terror. They cannot see the magnificent, terrible dance of armored leviathans in the freezing dark. They do not know the trajectory of incoming plasma torpedo spreads or the terrifying, blinding glow of charging lance batteries. They only know the catastrophic, bone-rattling noise that follows. Thousands of meters beyond their claustrophobic cage, beams of concentrated stellar fury slam into the invisible bubble of the ship's void shields. These ancient protective barriers do not merely absorb incoming fire. They warp the fundamental fabric of real space to shunt apocalyptic energies directly into the Empyrean. However, the physical displacement of such immeasurable power comes with a terrifying kinetic cost. When a capital-class macro battery or torpedo spread strikes the shield matrix, the sheer kinetic and thermal shockwave reverberates down through the adamantium spine of the vessel. The structural physics of Imperial naval architecture demand that this immense kinetic bleed-off be distributed throughout the adamantium keel and internal skeleton of the ship. As a result, the macrostructure groans under millions of tons of displaced pressure. Thick armor plating cracks and shifts like tectonic plates. The sudden fluctuations in internal temperature cause the immense iron bulkheads to sweat, bleeding thick rivers of chemical condensation. Down in the crushing darkness, the indentured laborers are knocked completely off their feet by these invisible, localized earthquakes. To Kael and his surviving kin, the concept of a tactical void engagement simply does not exist. They do not know if the guns aimed at them belong to traitorous heretics, bloodthirsty Xenos, or mindless abominations from beyond the veil. In their localized nightmare, there is no enemy fleet. There is only the abyss, and the abyss is screaming at them. Every impact upon the distant shields translates into a deafening, resonant boom that ruptures eardrums and shatters the brittle lumen globes swinging above. The air pressure spikes and drops with agonizing unpredictability, making every breath a desperate struggle. They are trapped within the belly of a dying metal beast, utterly blind to the predators tearing at its flesh. As the relentless bombardment from the void intensifies, the structural integrity of the lower decks begins to buckle under the impossible strain. The localized quakes grow in frequency and sheer, devastating power. Somewhere deep within the rusted labyrinth of the lower decks, vital systems that have endured for centuries finally begin to fracture. Chapter 14. Flickering Gravity and Broken Bones. The outer hull screams as macro munitions hammer against the adamantium skin of the vessel. Physical impacts of this magnitude do more than tear metal. They shatter the internal physics of the cruiser. Deep within the slave decks, the shuddering trauma of the assault translates into catastrophic system failures. The temperamental machine spirits governing the deck's artificial grav plating abruptly abandon their wards. Without warning, the deck hums with a sickening resonance and gravity ceases to exist. The sudden silence of the grav plating is more terrifying than the roar of battle. Hundreds of terrified serfs lose their footing, drifting helplessly into the stagnant air of the macro battery. Massive iron chains, loose plasteel tools, and the heavy detritus of 1,000 years of labor drift untethered in a chaotic, weightless ballet. Kael reacts with the sharp instinct of a survivor. He throws his arms around a fixed iron strut, locking his muscles tight as the world around him unmoors itself. To understand this terror, one must understand the ruthless calculus of an Imperial warship in the heat of combat. When a vessel of this size takes critical damage, the machine spirit prioritizes the holy weapons of retribution over all else. The great plasma reactors blindly divert their furious energy to the failing void shields and the starving lances. The secondary systems of the lower decks are starved of power and left at the mercy of wildly fluctuating energy grids. Life support protocols and artificial gravity are sacrificed without a second thought. Environmental seals weaken, and the delicate grav plating becomes a volatile hazard rather than a stable foundation. The tech priests care nothing for the millions of disposable souls toiling in the dark. Their lives are merely acceptable losses in the grand mathematics of void warfare. The momentary weightlessness is a cruel illusion of peace. It is shattered mere seconds later when the power grid surges and the gravity slams back into existence. It does not return to normal. It returns with bone, shattering, amplified intensity. The sudden, crushing reassertion of the artificial gravity pulls everything from the air with terrifying velocity. Hundreds of slaves, tons of chain and heavy iron tools plummet simultaneously to the unyielding floor. The sound that follows is a unified, sickening crunch. Hundreds of femurs, ribs and spines snap in perfect, horrific synchronization. Blood mists the air as frail mortal bodies are pulverized under the violent amplification of their own weight. Kael clings desperately to his iron strut, his arms screaming in agony under the doubled strain. He can do nothing but watch his fellow workers violently strike the deck below, transformed instantly into broken, lifeless husks. The cries of the shattered survivors echo through the dark, but they are soon drowned out by a deeper, more primal sound. The reinforced hull plating beside them begins to groan under a pressure it can no longer withstand. The outer armor is failing, preparing to let the true, freezing horror of the void into the ship. Chapter 15. The Maw of the Abyss. Hull breach. The fleeting weightlessness of the failed gravity field is shattered by the wrath of the enemy. The catastrophic kinetic impact of an enemy macro shell shatters the outer flank of the warship, obliterating the ancient physical hull that stands between the sprawling gun deck and the freezing vacuum of the void. The resulting breach is a jagged maw of annihilation ripped directly into the side of the colossal vessel. Instantly, the pressurized atmosphere inside the loading bay violently erupts outward into the unforgiving vacuum. A deafening, catastrophic roar eclipses the agonizing sounds of battle as the air itself is weaponized by the violent depressurization. The sudden loss of pressure flash freezes the ambient humidity, summoning a blinding storm of crystalline fog that scours the flesh of the damned. This violent equalization turns the massive ammunition deck into a wind tunnel of relentless, inescapable slaughter. Hundreds of macro cannon loaders, still securely tethered to their heavy iron hauling chains, are abruptly yanked toward the cosmic abyss. Their desperate screams are stolen by the silence of space as they are hurled violently through the freezing tempest. Fragile human forms are ruthlessly pulverized against the jagged, twisted edges of the torn plasteel hull, their bones shattering upon the ruined bulkhead. Blood instantly boils and freezes in the vacuum, painting the starry expanse with the gruesome mist of 100 ruptured bodies. Kael desperately anchors himself to a fixed loading winch, his torn hands bleeding from the immense strain as he forcefully exhales, purging his lungs to save them from rupturing in the explosive decompression. His lungs burn with the agonizing fire of oxygen deprivation. Deafened by the roaring gale of the escaping atmosphere, he can only watch in absolute, helpless terror as half of his assigned labor shift is effortlessly sucked into the infinite blackness. To survive the killing cold of the void, Imperial vessels are eternally blessed with ruthless automated fail-safes and uncompromising survival doctrines. The dormant machine spirit of the gun deck immediately senses the catastrophic loss of internal pressure and awakens the automated emergency bulkhead protocols. These ancient subroutines possess no capacity for mercy and calculate no acceptable parameters for human loss. Massive blast doors, forged from meters-thick slabs of dense plasteel and ceramite, descend from the reinforced ceiling with terrifying, unyielding speed. The descending bulkheads strike the deck plating with an earth-shattering force, indiscriminately crushing any thralls unfortunate enough to be caught beneath their immense weight. Limbs, chains, and torsos are brutally sheared into unrecognizable pulp as the impregnable barriers lock into place with a definitive, booming finality. The immediate devouring threat of the void is banished, but the salvation offered by the adamantium blast doors brings only a different breed of slow execution. Kael and the traumatized surviving laborers now find themselves securely sealed within a crippled, rapidly dying room. The heavy atmosphere is thick with the copper stench of fresh blood and the quickly depleting remnants of breathable oxygen. Their exhausted lungs violently heave in the thinning air, desperate for sustenance that no longer exists. Yet, despite the suffocation and the surrounding carnage, the merciless crack of the electro-whips soon echoes through the sealed and doomed chamber. The relentless overseers, completely indifferent to the recent massacre and the choking atmosphere, loudly command that the sacred task of loading the macro cannon must continue. The very air of the gun deck had become a poisonous soup of vaporized coolant and hard radiation. Green, toxic mist hissed from ruptured vents, mingling with the oily black smoke of localized chemical fires that burned ferociously without the need for ambient oxygen. Hundreds of corpses already paved the metal decking, their flesh blistering beneath the toxic fog. Yet there was no reprieve. The sharp crack of the electro-whip slashed through the choking haze, a sound louder than the dying groans of the asphyxiated. The overseers strode through the carnage like heralds of the abyss, their faces hidden behind heavy brass rebreathers. They did not care that the deck was tearing itself apart. They only cared that the holy chain remained taut. Kael stumbled over the charred remains of a fallen crewmate, coughing thick ropes of blood from his ruined lungs. Every breath was a mouthful of acid and ash. Given the choice between the agonizing burn of the atmosphere and the flaying agony of the lash, Kael threw his bruised shoulder back into the iron harness. Around him, thousands of half-dead serfs did the same, driven by a primal fear that eclipsed even the instinct to breathe. It was a surreal nightmare of industry. Dying men and women were forced to heave the spire-sized warhead across a floor that was actively melting beneath their boots. Their muscles tore and their hearts gave out, but the monolithic brass shell inched forward. To understand this madness is to understand the absolute rigidity of Imperial Navy doctrine. High above this burning hellscape, in the sterile and pristine vaults of the command bridge, the reality of the lower decks simply does not exist. A Lord Captain does not see screaming serfs melting in radioactive fire. He sees only a glowing rune on a tactical cogitator. Naval engagements are mathematical equations fought across hundreds of thousands of kilometers of void, governed by schedules of fire measured down to the microsecond. If Port Battery Quartus is ordered to unleash its payload at exactly the 14th second of the engagement, that battery must fire. A delay of a single heartbeat throws off the macro calculations of the entire fleet formation. The officers on the bridge do not care about a structural breach, a sudden loss of gravity, or a localized warp leak. The ship is a machine and the crew is merely the lubricant that ensures the machine cycles on time. The disconnect is absolute and terrifying. The bridge issues a demand for death, and the lower decks pay for that demand with an ocean of blood. And so the blood flowed freely across Battery 4. Kael closed his eyes as the screams of the dying blended with the shrieking metal of the great macro cannon. His boots slipped on gore and coolant, but the collective momentum of 1,000 desperate souls propelled the colossal munition upward into the loading cradle. The chains locked tight with a deafening metallic clang. Hydraulic rams, weeping black fluid from damaged seals, groaned as they pushed the gargantuan shell forward. With a final heavy thud, the warhead slid into the gaping maw of the weapon. The colossal adamantium breech block slid heavily along its reinforced locking grooves, shutting out the only source of light left in the chamber. The immense iron locks engaged, slamming shut to seal their doom. Chapter 17. The ignition of the God Engine. The great labor is complete. The massive breach locks into place with the finality of a closing tomb. Now begins the true terror of the firing sequence. Deep within the armored bulkheads, colossal plasma capacitors begin to cycle. The resulting electromagnetic hum is not merely heard, but felt deep within the marrow. It is a hateful frequency that vibrates the rotting, blackened teeth in the skulls of the loading slaves. Blinding crimson warning lights strobe across the gun deck, washing the terrified serfs in the color of fresh blood. Then comes the phenomenon known to the void, born as the breath of the gun. A sudden, terrifying silence falls over the vast chamber. Every echo, every scrape of chain, and every whimpering prayer is sucked into the gravitational vacuum of the weapon's firing chamber. To fire a weapon of such apocalyptic scale is an act of engineering hubris that defies human comprehension. The macro cannon does not simply launch a projectile. It ignites a controlled cataclysm of chemical fury to hurl death across the void. Vast magazines of highly volatile macro-propellant and solid-state thermic charges flood the primary ignition chambers, detonating in a deafening sequence to violently propel the monolithic shell. This unholy amalgamation of chemical fury and electromagnetic accelerator coils is required to hurl tens of thousands of tons of mass at devastating sublight velocities across the void. The sheer physical forces involved are astronomical. Before the shell even clears the barrel, the firing chamber struggles to contain an immense thermal blowback that could incinerate a lesser vessel from the inside out. The barrel itself expands, groaning under the pressure of a localized sun. Then comes the ignition. There are no words in High Gothic to adequately describe the world-ending volume of a macro weapon unleashing its wrath. It is a concussive shockwave of absolute sensory annihilation. The air itself turns into a solid wall of kinetic force that shatters the atmosphere of the gun deck. Tympanic membranes rupture instantly across the sprawling labor gangs. Thousands of slaves are struck deaf in a single microsecond of violence. Amidst the blinding flash and the crushing pressure, Kael collapses to the grated floor. He covers his bleeding ears, screaming with all the breath left in his lungs. He cannot hear his own voice. He exists only in a silent, vibrating hell of agonizing pain, completely overwhelmed by the catastrophic birth of the macro cannon shell. The apocalyptic payload has finally left the ship, tearing through the cold void toward its distant target. Yet the violence upon the gun deck is far from over. The immovable laws of physics demand their tithe in flesh and forged steel. The universe dictates that every violent action carries an equal and devastating reaction. The glorious shell has departed, but millions of tons of kinetic recoil are already traveling back down the length of the mighty barrel. The terrible wrath of the machine spirit is turning inward, and the true nightmare of the firing cycle is about to strike the deck. The wrath of the Emperor has been delivered, but the toll of its delivery remains to be paid. For every action of such titanic violence, there is an equal and apocalyptic reaction. The colossal barrel of the macro cannon is thrown backward with cataclysmic force. Hydraulic recoil dampeners the size of cathedral naves and gravitic arresters scream as they attempt to arrest the staggering mass of the retreating weapon. Even these monumental shock absorbers cannot contain the sheer kinetic fury generated by the firing sequence. A catastrophic bleed-off of energy explodes outward into the enclosed gun deck. A terrifying wave of concussive pressure and superheated steam washes over the vast expanse of the firing chamber. Hundreds of indentured thralls are caught out in the open. The sheer physical force of the invisible shockwave lifts them from the iron deck and violently hurls them against the adamantium bulkheads. Flesh and bone are instantaneously liquefied by the overwhelming pressure of the blast. Those spared the crushing force of the impact face a far more agonizing fate. Vast exhaust vents rupture under the strain, vomiting dense clouds of boiling steam directly into the primary slave pens. Trapped in the roaring white mist, entire work gangs are cooked alive in a matter of seconds. Amidst this maelstrom of sudden destruction, Kael survives entirely by sheer desperate luck. He cowers behind the rusted and immovable bulk of a gargantuan chain winch. From his meagre sanctuary, he watches the searing vapour boil the flesh from the bones of his cruel overseer and his fellow labourers alike. Their dying screams are drowned out by the groaning metal of the cooling cannon. To the uninitiated mind, this slaughter might seem like a tragic failure of engineering. Yet within the merciless calculus of the Imperial Navy, it is nothing more than a baseline operational standard. The loss of hundreds of disposable souls to Recoil bleed off during a sustained barrage is already factored into the vast logistical ledgers of the vessel. Flesh is the cheapest and most abundant resource in the entire imperium of man. The Mechanicus Magi who designed these Leviathan warships understood that shielding the lower gun decks would require precious adamantium better spent on exterior armor plating. Therefore, the incinerated and the crushed are mathematically categorized as acceptable casualty rates. It is considered a highly optimal exchange rate to spend the lives of thousands of lowest-tier deck slaves to shave mere microseconds off the firing cycle that guarantees the total obliteration of a heretic warship. There is no mourning for the fallen, only the cold turning of the great bureaucratic wheel. Slowly, the raging atmospheric cyclers begin to draw the boiling mist up toward the vaulted ceiling. The dense fog of cooked blood, vaporized coolant and ozone finally starts to thin. As the steam clears from the cavernous chamber, it reveals a truly horrific landscape. The deck is absolutely littered with the charred and broken remains of the dead and the dying. Twitching masses of ruined flesh lie strewn across the scorched floor grates like discarded rags. The gun has fired, but the labor of the macro battery is far from over. The cooling coils are already hissing, demanding fresh attention from the surviving crew. The next monstrous artillery shell is waiting in the magazine depths below. The blood must be washed from the loading rails, and the shattered corpses must be unceremoniously shoved into the protein reclamation chutes. A new work shift of terrified reinforcements is already being driven through the heavy blast doors by armed enforcers. The cleanup must begin immediately, for the void war still rages, and the cannons must roar again. Chapter 19. The Protein Harvest. The echoes of the great gun fade into the iron bones of the ship, replaced by the relentless hiss of pressure hoses. Through the lingering chemical smoke march the cleanup details. Lobotomized sanitation servitors and the lowest caste of deck ratings arrive dragging heavy flensing tools and rusted bore hoses. There is no reverence here, only the brutal efficiency of a slaughterhouse. The broken, cooked and crushed bodies of the gun crew are unceremoniously scraped from the scorched deck plates. Shattered bone and jellied flesh are scooped into rusted wheelbarrows and dumped directly into the yawning iron grinder chutes that plunge deep into the bowels of the vessel. Torrents of chemically treated water blast the remaining viscera into the runoff trenches. The lifeblood of hundreds flows away into the dark, putrid bilges below. Kael sits slumped against a cooling bulkhead, entirely deafened by the blast. He watches pieces of his lifelong workmates being hosed down the drain. He feels absolutely nothing. The trauma of his existence has burned away all capacity for grief, leaving only a hollow void of survival. No hymns are sung for the fallen. No clerics wave censers over the ruined meat. No scribes linger to record the names of the dead, for they never possessed true names to begin with, only numbers stamped into their flesh and ledgers. They are simply biological waste, swept aside to ensure the great weapon never ceases its mechanical rhythm. Yet the Imperium wastes nothing, least of all the flesh of its servants. The chutes beneath the gun deck do not lead to incinerators, but directly to the immense protein recyclers of the void ship. Here lies the grim reality of corpse starch. The dead of the gun deck are immediately ground down into a coarse paste, boiled in massive vats to achieve a marginal state of sterilization, and pressed into dense nutrient rations. Alchemical nutrient binders and harsh chem preservatives are folded into the human slurry before it is stamped into rigid grey blocks of corpse starch that taste forever of copper and ash. This is a completely closed biological loop of endless suffering. When the klaxons finally sound for the brief respite of the meal cycle, Kael and the other survivors will eagerly devour the rations placed before them. They will chew on the heavily processed remains of the very men and women who stood beside them just a shift prior. Flesh feeds flesh, sustaining the living just long enough to see them broken in turn. The grinding teeth of the recyclers churn beneath their feet, consuming the harvest of the recoil. Above, the gun deck is quickly rendered clear of the dead. The colossal breech of the macro cannon stands open once more, a dark and hungry maw waiting in the dim light. Heavy chains begin to rattle in the distance. A new shell is already being hauled forward from the deep magazines. The cycle of the ship demands new flesh to replace the old. The brass decking begins to cool beneath the hissing vents of the atmospheric scrubbers. Mindless servitors with heavy power hoses slowly scour the scorched iron plates, washing away the choking ash and the broken bodies of the fallen. The crimson slurry vanishes down the deep grated sumps, destined to be purified by the life sustainers and fed back to the surviving crew as nutrient paste. For a fleeting, miserable moment, a hollow silence claims the vast expanse of the gun deck. It is the terrible quiet of a mass graveyard drifting through the cold void. Then the colossal blast doors grind open once more. The blinding, sterile light of the ordnance vaults spills into the gloom, revealing the true master of this metal domain. Another spire-sized macro shell is slowly dragged into the cathedral chamber. It is a towering monument of wrought iron, dense diamantine, and heavy plasteel, heavily consecrated in sacred oils and destined to burn in the name of the emperor. But the great engine cannot feed itself. To replace the thousands who just died, the grim flesh tithe is collected from the bowels of the vessel. Hundreds of young, terrified children are herded violently onto the elevated loading gantries. Some are newly dragged from the lightless deep deck hab warrens, shivering and pale in the stale, recycled shipboard air. Others are the pathetic spoils of ruthless press gangs, violently stolen from planetary spaceports and forced into the belly of the Leviathan. They weep and tremble uncontrollably as the sheer, crushing scale of the void ship looms over their fragile bodies. They are nothing but fresh gristle for the infinite Imperial mill. Among the lines of surviving veterans, Kael stands completely devoid of pity. His mind has shattered and reformed, and his soul has aged 1,000 years in the span of a single engagement. The horrific realities of the gun deck have entirely burned away his humanity, leaving only the absolute cold efficiency of a mechanical cog. He reaches out with calloused hands, grabbing a weeping child by the shoulder. Without a single spoken word, Kael forces the young boy into a heavy leather pulling harness. The thick canvas straps are still wet and slick with the fresh, uncoagulated blood of its previous, pulverized owner. Kael locks the heavy iron buckles with practiced, terrifying indifference, physically sealing the crying child to the massive dragging chain. He does not offer any comfort, for there is absolutely no comfort to be found in the unforgiving dark between the stars. He merely straps the next doomed generation of meat to the chains, teaching them the agonizing rhythm of the haul. This is the ultimate, undeniable truth of the Imperium of man. There is no glorious end to this endless, grinding war. There is no beautiful final victory waiting to be claimed in the burning ashes of the galaxy. The universe is infinitely cold, and the cathedral ship is profoundly uncaring. Countless billions will live, bleed, and turn to dust in the long shadows of these macro guns without ever seeing a natural sky. The God engine is forever hungry, its sacred altar demanding an unending tithe of mortal suffering. High above the trembling ranks of serfs, the overseer raises his augmented arm. The sharp, agonizing crack of an electro-whip suddenly shatters the heavy air. A chorus of broken voices cries out in desperate unison as the colossal groan of heavy iron chains pulls taut once more.